My name is Dominic King. My wife Stephanie and I have been at Gateway for about 8 months since moving to Mission from Calgary, Alberta. And what a blessing it has been to be welcomed and so well loved during this big transition in our lives. I have the privilege of serving at the Gateway production ministry, operating the cameras, and I look forward to joining the choir this upcoming season. Our text this morning is Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 to 37. Hear now the word of the Lord. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.
This passage comes to us in a whole portion of text called the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, as I know I have told you before, and I know I will tell you again, is one of my favorite portions of the scripture text. And in those teachings, Jesus himself, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time telling us about how we come to know him. But in very clear terms, Jesus tells us in and through the words that he uses, how he has called us, how he has called his faith family, you and I, to live out the faith that we have in him. But now near the beginning of this collection of teachings, Jesus articulates that everything in the Jewish law, everything that the Jews have lived into over the whole period of the Old Testament times, that they've lived into, that's been recorded up until now, is about the setting the stage for a life lived for himself. Jesus tells us that Matthew 5, verse 17, backing up our text a little bit. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And as I think about the Jews and how they were looking for the Messiah to save them, I remember the fact that the Jews were looking forward to the Messiah to save them from the Roman occupation. These Roman soldiers, they ran their cities, they ran their villages. They also submitted them to Roman taxation. But I think somewhere in the hearts of these Jewish people, they also had in their hearts that somehow this Messiah that would come would also free them up from some of the rules and some of the regulations that they had in this whole world of Jewish law. But Jesus tells them that everything that was written by these early Jewish leaders in the books of the law, most notably the book of Leviticus, inspired by the Spirit, of course, that everything was written there to point them to be a different people, to be set apart in a world around them, so that they would look and function differently than the people around in the rest of society. And that through their example, they would point all people to Yahweh, to God the Father, to Jesus himself. Jesus articulates through the text that we're reading here that all this law was all about himself. He goes on at 5 verse 18, and he says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless the righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And so here we see Jesus saying that the law will not change. We're still called to live different lives for the world around us. But he explains further that when we water down the law, or when we search for loopholes, or when we negotiate ourselves from doing what the law actually tells us to do, he says we'll find ourselves in some pretty tricky territory. We'll be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And so the Sermon on the Mount is all about Jesus calling his disciples, people who are choosing to live in the kingdom of heaven, to a deeper living, where we're to be more aware of our motives behind everything that we do. And so Jesus stresses to us that living for him and living into a life that is reflective of his kingdom has more to do with looking at our internal obedience than it has to do with our external performance. But I'll say that with this one caveat, that one does lead to the other. How we live internally does express in how we live ourselves externally. But the Jewish leaders, these scribes, these Pharisees that Jesus is very pointedly speaking to, they were all about the external performance. They were all about being seen doing what they're supposed to be doing. And later, Jesus even tells us, later on in, I think, Matthew 6, Jesus tells them that they have received their reward, that they've received it in full, because they've been noticed by others. But the goal of the life of the disciple of Jesus isn't to be noticed by others. Being noticed by Jesus and God the Father is. And so in these collected teachings, Jesus does something pretty fascinating as he deepens further the understanding of these laws. For example, before we get to our text today, we're going to look at 5 verse 21. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be liable to judgment." And so here in this first text here, Jesus quotes the 6th commandment of the 10 commandments, which says that murder is wrong. Where at the end of the day, anybody following the letter of the law can pat themselves on the back by saying, "I didn't kill anybody today. I did great." But he deepens the command to not just be about the action of murder, the action of taking someone's life, but to also include then the motivation of anger and hatred that would lead towards the action of the murder or taking someone's life. He says it's more about that internal obedience, about the motivation and the state of your heart, than it is about the external performance. But now I'm sure as these Jewish leaders were walking around, they were marching around pronouncing that they didn't kill anybody today, and they're patting themselves on the back saying, "Hey, we did great today." But meanwhile, under their breath, they're pronouncing hatred and anger towards people who live life a little bit differently. And so Jesus here pronounces 5 more statements. He now repeats this process 5 more times. In 5 verse 27, he says it's not about the action of committing adultery, but it's about lust. In 5 verse 31, it's not about divorce, it's about unfaithful living. In 5:33, where we're going to hang out today, is not just about the oaths that we make, but it's about being truthful. In 5:38, it's not just about an eye for an eye, it's about changing your posture to receiving it on the cheek. In 5 verse 43, it's not about hating your enemy, but it's about taking a posture of praying for your enemy. And so in all this, we see in large terms about how Jesus is calling us to live lives that's not so that others would notice us, but that we would make an imprint of him for those around us. That because of how we live, others would in fact see Christ. So now let's take a closer look at what Jesus says about making oaths. Matthew 5:33 again. Jesus says, "Again, you have heard of..." Wow, I can never say that one properly. "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.' But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." And so like we've been doing throughout this series so far, is that we've been talking about the big idea, that we piece through the text and find out where Jesus articulates a problem to emerge, and then we'll see some of his solutions. So we're going to do just the same thing this morning. So the big idea here is really, really quite simple, and it's just simply this, that the disciples of Jesus should be honest and should be trustworthy. It's right there in the text, friends. Jesus cannot be too much clearer. He says, let what you say be simply yes or no. Well, let's walk through the text. Again, verse 33. "Again, you have heard it was said of old, to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." Now, unlike the other passages that Jesus says, but I say to you, questions and statements, he's quoting actual single verses of text. But in this particular one that we're looking at, he actually summarizes a few. So here, first one in Leviticus 19, verse 12. it's recorded saying, "You shall swear not by my name falsely, and wow, I cannot speak this morning. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord." Then in Numbers 30, it said, "If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all what proceeds from his mouth." Then Deuteronomy 23, it says at verse 21, "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed through your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God, and you have promised with your mouth." So early Jewish history, they were an oral culture. Everything was spoken. Very little was written down. Meaning that when commitments and promises were being made between two people, that had to be followed through with. It was just a simple agreement that they would hold each other accountable. And even at times, they would literally hold each other accountable to those commitments. But in Genesis 24, we have a really neat example of this commitment being held. It's a promise that's being made, an oath that's being made between Abraham and one of his servants. Genesis 24, verse 1, it says, "Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servants, the oldest of his household, who had charge of over all he had, listen to this, 'Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, from whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac.'" And so this was an oath being made with the servant's hand literally under the thigh of Abraham, where he literally held the matters of life and in death in the palm of his hand. And don't let your mind wander too far about what he's actually holding. And there in that moment, they were agreeing to each other that this is what the action was going to be. They didn't have contracts they were going to sign. They didn't have a lawyer witnessing any kind of agreement. They had each other's words, which meant that with and alongside the Lord's instruction behind them, they must follow through. And so God's instruction to his people was, again, that they were to live out as a different people, a set-apart nation, that they would, in fact, live differently, and they would be good on their word, because the Lord has called them to this higher place of living. So they could and they should swear by something, for something in God's name, because it caused them to actually do it. Otherwise, outside of that, they knew the consequences if they didn't follow through. And so they would, and they would swear, they would make commitments upon the Lord's name, and they were held to it. But as time went on, and the Jewish leaders started recording all the ins and outs of this law, they started to write an additional text called the Mishnah. And in there, they included gray areas and portions of this text that left room for different interpretations. They articulated areas where you must follow through with your commitments when you swore by the Lord's name, or other areas that you were allowed not necessarily to follow through with because you swore by something else. Essentially, what these Jewish leaders were doing in these moments were writing into their practices the permission to lie. Let's go back at verse 34. Jesus continues on. He says, "But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black." And so here Jesus is beginning to pick up on these loopholes of being able to swear by good and godly things, but not necessarily God himself. Things like heaven, which is the throne of God, or the earth, which is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, which is the center of his worship. And so to these Jewish leaders, as they made these oaths by heaven, by earth, or by Jerusalem, they were seeking to sound all kinds of super spiritual side of their life. They made it sound like they were intending on following through with their commitments. But because they weren't commitments or oaths made in God's name, they weren't necessarily held accountable to following through with their words. They wouldn't follow through with them then, and they would be let off scot-free. They wouldn't be liable to judgment, and they can kind of slip through the cracks and find their own ways to do things. And then they also were starting to make oaths in their own names and of themselves, as if they had any ability to add any kind of authority to their promises just simply because of who they were. But what we were really seeing here is that only God can do those things. Then Jesus ends in verse 37. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. And so here we then see the heart of Jesus, simply wanting his followers to be clear and to be concise, to live such good lives that they don't need to invoke any name or to be anything to be received as truthful, but to simply be honest and to simply be trustworthy. Anything more than a yes or a no was just us trying to manipulate God and just us trying to manipulate each other, which is only inspired by the evil that is in our hearts and will be used further by the schemes of the devil to undermine the growth of God's kingdom. And so the problem that Jesus is really spelling out here is that the disciples of Jesus are not always honest and trustworthy. We need to recognize that we've been like that ever since the beginning, ever since that fall of humanity into sin, when Adam and Eve then first took that first bite of that fruit, and humanity was forever changed. And as we often talk about here, it's placing our mirrors in our Bibles and seeing ourselves being reflected in this text. And so as we place our mirrors in this particular text, we will see too that like these Jewish leaders, we are also liars. And when we think about us being liars, the sad part of this truth is that we don't have to teach our children how to lie. They do it instinctively. And then we continue to do it ourselves out of our own broken nature. And sometimes we even do that without thinking. And that scares me. And I think we do one of two things when we lie. The first thing we do when we lie is when we lie about our experiences, we lie about our lives, we manipulate and we exaggerate those truths. And so doing that, we puff ourselves up. We make ourselves look better than we actually do. It's the time-old fishing story. You know, when that fish gets bigger every time you tell the story. Or that the story of the race that we tried to win. And every time we tell that story, our time gets a little bit better. We moved a little bit quicker. And I'm pretty positive that we are all guilty of these kinds of lies. Because we're so eager in our sinful nature to be seen as better than we actually are. We're trying to convey a better experience than we've actually had. And I think as we do those things, we make our lives actually harder. Because we're perpetuating those lies, it takes an extraordinary amount of work. And the second thing I think we do as we lie is that we conceal our sin. Back in my house growing up, my mom would always buy these little candies called jujubes. These little pieces of fruity and sugary goodness. Inevitably, whoever would take the last little piece of candy, the last jujube from the bag, would leave the bag behind. This would disappoint my parents all the time, as they would call out who took the last jujube and who left the bag in the drawer, expecting us to, throw away our own garbage. But inevitably, what would happen there in that moment is that they would shout that out. Me, my brother, my sister would just be pointing fingers at each other. It was never me. It was never me. It was always her. It was always him. Sometimes it was even we blamed the cat because, we didn't want to admit our own shortcomings. But here, 25 to 30 years later, mom and dad all admit, sometimes it was me. So I apologize for that. But concealing our sin is not just about leaving the empty bag there in the drawer. We don't admit to leaving the bag because we're embarrassed about our actions. We don't want to face the consequences. And so we hide our activities. We make up stories to protect ourselves. We place blame in other directions. But then hopefully through those actions, we will see the effects of our actions. And hopefully we'll be drawn to commit to be better. And so that the next time around, we actually then deal with our garbage. And we might get into that pattern for a season, which is good. But our sinful nature and who we are always has us return to our sinful ways. And we might find ourselves continuing to go back to hide our poor decisions. We might hide our poor decisions around our use of time. Maybe an abuse of alcohol. Maybe we go back to doom scrolling, looking where we shouldn't. Maybe it's a return back to thinking less of other people just because of their nationalities. But Jesus says to us, when he says, let what you say be simply yes or no, Jesus is telling us that we need to speak with integrity. So the Bible teaches us in Proverbs 12, verse 22, he says, it's written there, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. And then Paul writes this to the Ephesians at 4:29. He says, let no corrupting talk, or as the NIV says, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only such that is good for the building up as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. You see, when we use words, we have a choice. One, to either bless and encourage, or two, to either tear down and destroy. And I think it's clear the direction that the Lord would have us live. Secondly, another way that we look like these Jewish leaders is that we too are always looking for these loopholes. And I think this is a growing problem in our world, and I don't think it's anything new since the dawn of time as sin entered the world, is that we're always looking to get away with the most we can with the least amount of effort to get further ahead. And I think Adam and Eve there understood this too, way back in the Garden of Eden. They had been eating that fruit from the tree that God told them not to. And then God approaches them there in the garden in Genesis 3. And this is Adam's response to God. He says, Genesis 3, verse 12, the woman whom you gave here to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate. And Adam here in this moment, he tries to squeeze out of being in trouble by saying it was Eve's fault. It's the woman who you put here with me, it's her fault. He was looking for the easy way out. He was looking for this little loophole, as it wasn't actually him who picked the fruit off the tree. But he was no less culpable, as the fruit was still in his hand. I have this picture of the fruit of the juices of the fruit being all over his face still. What's the first thing you do when you get a parking ticket? What's the first thing you do when you get a speeding ticket? You look for the errors in it to see that maybe your name was spelled wrong so you can get off the hook. Or maybe when you're in a parking lot and you accidentally nick another car with your own, and you think how easily it would be just to simply put your car in reverse and drive on out of there rather than leave your number. How many times have you heard of people cheating on their taxes, not being super truthful, claiming more than they should? Or maybe you hear people combing through the fine print looking for the easy way out of all that legalese. These patterns are so easily wired within us to do our best to advance ourselves forward rather than to accept the consequences that might be right in front of us. You see, again, we're always looking to get the farthest with the least amount of effort and at the most minimal cost. And I think so are the Jewish leaders here. So much so when they put pen to paper with this law, they created a system that allowed for so much wiggle room within their oaths, allowing them to advance in the eye of humanity, to look more polished in their religious activities. But all they were doing in the process was just simply patting themselves on their backs. And Jesus says, let what you say be simply yes or no. And he tells us that we are to speak with simplicity. And so James, the brother of Jesus, reiterates this whole verse when he writes James 5, verse 12. He says, but above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and let your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. And then our dear brother Paul, he writes to the 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. He says, for God is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. For God is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. And then on a different scale, and I think even a little bit harder to really dissect, like the Jewish leaders, we doubt and we question everything. And I think when we look at this world we call our home, we quickly see that there is just such a lack of trust in this world. We constantly see people living out their lives in a different way than we might anticipate. Someone says they're going to show up, but they don't. They say they're going to charge a certain amount for a job that's been completed, but the invoice reflects way more. Someone says that they won't share that personal story that you've just been honest with them, but it comes back to you from a different friend. So often our actions don't line up with our words. But when we say we're going to do one thing, we end up doing another thing, which causes our world to doubt and to question our words and our motivations for sharing our faith and for living out God's love. Going back to Jesus here, and he's confronting the Jewish leaders again. Matthew 23, he has a lot of things to say to them. But here in the middle, Matthew 23, verse 25, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and you Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but the inside are full of greed and of self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside may also be clean." And so Jesus points out here to these Jewish leaders who were only concerned with their external performance, with being seen by the others, rather than working on their internal obedience. He tells them that they need to clean up their motivations, to be aware of their state of their hearts, and to put more attention into the state of their souls. That way their actions and how they live out would be then more reflective of the kind of God that he is. And I think today we are not too different. Now, we've also harmed ourselves in this process too, because we haven't given the world something to fully trust. And like the Jewish leaders, we say we're going to live a certain way, but then we don't. We make sure that we get all prettied up for church on a Sunday morning, but then on Monday morning, the world that we interact with, they see it in entirely different ways. I remember a testimony I heard some time ago, it was actually quite a while back, that I heard someone share of God's goodness and how they were receiving an insane amount of forgiveness from the Lord and how they had planned to live out differently from that day forward. But then through the week, I saw a post on Facebook that didn't line up with how this person had shared their testimony and the experiences that they were trying to do living forward. And now I know, I have to know this, that it's not for me to judge. It's up to me as a person to observe who heard the story, to go in and confront, and we did all those things, and that was good. But in those moments, I have to still admit that my worldview was shaped in that moment, that there was a doubt that happened as I saw this person live out a whole different way. But I also had this moment too of like, this is how our world sees us. This is how our world interacts with us. And while it's not the goal to get the whole people to see us all doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing, but we still need to give a good impression on what the Lord is. We keep on saying one thing, but we keep on living entirely different. So we have to be so careful in the things that we say and the things we commit to. While we might sound super spiritual and the community around us might be impacted, we need to be sure that the character underneath, the state of our hearts, the awareness of our souls, the motivation of our hearts, reflects then the character of God's honesty and his truthfulness to a world that is gripped so deep into brokenness and a lack of trust. And so as Jesus says, let what you say be simply yes or no, he tells us that we need to speak with clarity. And so in this world that is so confused, in this world that is so lost, one of the greatest gifts the followers of Jesus Christ can give to the world is to then speak with this clarity. And to not just be clear with the words that we use, but with our motivation to love our neighbor, with our motivation to share our desire to reflect God accurately to this broken and lost world. And Paul writes in one of his most famous chapters of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, where he talks about love in a whole lot of cool ways. He writes, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." If we're going to do anything in our lives but not show God's love in and through our words and our actions, we're only hindering the process of growing God's kingdom and seeing it expand here on this earth. And if we do all that, we'll simply just join and add to the noise of this lost world. Author, theologian, pastor John Piper, he writes this: "The burden of Jesus is that his people are to be so utterly and so deeply and so simply committed to tell the truth that they don't need buttresses to hold up their words. So simply let what you say be what you do, and let what you do be what you say. Nothing more and nothing less." And so as we've seen these three different responses to our dishonest lives, there's still yet a last one and a fourth one. Psalm 46, verse 10 says this: "Be still. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted amongst the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth." Maybe at times it's just best that we remain silent and to not use words at all, making sure that we're not hindering or standing in God's way, remembering all along that his words and his ways are always greater than ours. I think in additionally to all this, we need to acknowledge as well that we will always fall short of the glory of God. We will always mess up. We will always mix up our words We'll always forget to follow through. But that's our sinful nature, and we need to, as human beings, we need to acknowledge that. But there's a grace, and there's always grace. But as Jesus lived and as he taught, we see the greatest example of someone following through with his own words. And when he said yes to follow his Father's instructions, when he came down to this earth to show us this new way of life, he went all the way through. He taught, he healed, he gave us the greatest example of love, and then at the end of his time here on this earth, he stretched out his arms and with the fullest expression of all honesty and all trustworthiness that our world has ever seen. And for you and I, we're instructed to live in such a way that we point our world to that very truth.